extraordinary excitement reigning everywhere. And then, after he had been talking a long while, she suddenly shot a strange look at him. "I suppose you went to see the place," she said. And guiltily he acknowledged that he had done so. "Well?" "Well, there wasn't anything much to see, not now. But oh, Ellen, the daring of him! Why, Ellen, if the poor soul had had time to cry out, which they don't believe she had, it's impossible someone wouldn't 'a' heard her. They say that if he goes on doing it like that, in the afternoon like, he never will be caught. He must have just got mixed up with all the other people within 10 seconds of what he'd done." During the afternoon Bunting bought papers recklessly. In fact, he must have spent the best part of 6 pence. But in spite of all the supposed and suggested clues, there was nothing at all new to read, less, in fact, than ever before. The police, it was clear, were quite at a loss, and Mrs. Bunting began to feel curiously better, less tired, less ill, less terrified than she had felt through the morning. And then something happened which broke with dramatic suddenness the quietude of the day. They had had their tea, and Bunting was reading the last of the papers he had run out to buy, when suddenly there came a loud, thundering double knock at the door. Mrs. Bunting looked up, startled. "Why, whoever can that be?" she said. But as Bunting got up she added quickly, "You just sit down again. I'll go myself. Sounds like someone after lodgings. I'll soon send them to the right about." And then she left the room, but not before there had come another loud double knock. Mrs. Bunting opened the front door. In a moment she saw that the person who stood there was a stranger to her. He was a big, dark man with fierce, black moustaches. And somehow, she could not have told you why, he suggested a policeman to Mrs. Bunting's mind. This notion of hers was confirmed by the very first words he uttered. For, "I'm here to execute a warrant," he exclaimed in a theatrical, hollow tone. With a weak cry of protest Mrs. Bunting suddenly threw out her arms as if to bar the way. She turned deadly white. But then, in an instant, the supposed stranger's laugh rang out, with loud, jovial, familiar sound. "There now, Mrs. Bunting, I never thought I'd take you in as well as all that." It was Joe Chandler. Joe Chandler dressed up, as she knew he sometimes, not very often, did dress up in the course of his work. Mrs. Bunting began laughing helplessly, hysterically, just as she had done on the morning of Daisy's arrival, when the newspaper sellers had come shouting down the Marylebone Road. "What's all this about?" Bunting came out. Young Chandler ruefully shut the front door. "I didn't mean to upset her like this," he said, looking foolish. "'Twas just my silly nonsense, Mr. Bunting." And together they helped her into the sitting-room. But once there, poor Mrs. Bunting went on worse than ever. She threw her black apron over her face and began to sob hysterically. "I made sure she'd know who I was when I spoke," went on the young fellow apologetically. "But there now, I have upset her. I am sorry." "It don't matter," she exclaimed, throwing the apron off her face, but the tears were still streaming from her eyes as she sobbed and laughed by turns. "Don't matter one little bit, Joe. 'Twas stupid of me to be so taken aback. But there, that murder that's happened close by, it's just upset me altogether to-day." "Enough to upset anyone, that was," acknowledged the young man ruefully. "I've only come in for a minute, like. I haven't no right to come when I'm on duty like this." Joe Chandler was looking longingly at what remains of the meal were still on the table. "You can take a minute just to have a bite and a sup," said Bunting hospitably, "and then you can tell us any news there is, Joe. We're right in the middle of everything now, ain't we?" He spoke with evident enjoyment, almost pride, in the gruesome fact. Joe nodded. Already his mouth was full of bread and butter. He waited a moment, and then, "Well, I have got one piece of news, not that I suppose it'll interest you very much." They both looked at him. Mrs. Bunting suddenly calm, though her breast still heaved from time to time. "Our boss has resigned," said Joe Chandler slowly, impressively. "No, not the Commissioner of Police!" exclaimed Bunting. "Yes, he has. He just can't bear what's said about us any longer, and I don't wonder. He done his best, and so's we all. The public have just gone daft, in the West End, that is, to-day. As for the papers, well, they're something cruel, that's what they are. And the ridiculous ideas they print, you'd never believe the things they ask us to do, and quite serious like." "What do you mean?" questioned Mrs. Bunting. She really wanted to know. "Well, the Courier declares that there ought to be a house-to-house investigation all over London. Just think of it! Everybody to let the police go all over their house, from garret to kitchen, just to see if the Avenger isn't concealed there. Dotty, I calls it. Why, 'twould take us months and months just to do that one job in a town like London." "I'd like to see them dare come into my house," said Mrs. Bunting angrily. "It's all along of them blarsted papers that the Avenger went to work a different way this time," said Chandler slowly. Bunting had pushed a tin of sardines towards his guest, and was eagerly listening. "How do you mean?" he asked. "I don't take your meaning, Joe." "Well, you see, it's this way. The newspapers was always saying how extraordinary it was that the Avenger chose such a peculiar time to do his deeds. I mean, the time when no one's about the streets. Now, doesn't it stand to reason that the fellow, reading all that, and seeing the sense of it, said to himself, 'I'll go on another tack this time'? Just listen to this." He pulled a strip of paper, part of a column cut from a newspaper, out of his pocket. "An ex-Lord Mayor of London on the Avenger. Will the murderer be caught? Yes," replied Sir John, "he will certainly be caught, probably when he commits his next crime. A whole army of bloodhounds, metaphorical and literal, will be on his track the moment he draws blood again. With the whole community against him, he cannot escape, especially when it be remembered that he chooses the quietest hour in the 24 to commit his crimes. Londoners are now in such a state of nerves, if I may use the expression, in such a state of funk, that every passer-by, however innocent, is looked at with suspicion by his neighbour if his avocation happens to take him abroad between the hours of 1 and 3 in the morning. I'd like to gag that ex-Lord Mayor," concluded Joe Chandler wrathfully. Just then the lodger's bell rang. "Let me go up, my dear," said Bunting. His wife still looked pale and shaken by the fright she had had. "No, no," she said hastily. "You stop down here and talk to Joe. I'll look after Mr. Sleuth. He may be wanting his supper just a bit earlier than usual to-day." Slowly, painfully, again feeling as if her legs were made of cotton wool, she dragged herself up to the first floor, knocked at the door, and then went in. "You did ring, sir," she said, in her quiet, respectful way, and Mr. Sleuth looked up. She thought, but, as she reminded herself afterwards, it might have been just her idea and nothing else, that for the first time the lodger looked frightened and cowed. "I heard a noise downstairs," he said fretfully, "and I wanted to know what it was all about. As I told you, Mrs. Bunting, when I first took these rooms, quiet is essential to me." "It was just a friend of ours, sir. I'm sorry you were disturbed. Would you like the knocker taken off to-morrow? Bunting'll be pleased to do it if you don't like to hear the sound of the knocks." "Oh, no, I wouldn't put you to such a trouble as that." Mr. Sleuth looked quite relieved. "Just a friend of yours, was it, Mrs. Bunting? He made a great deal of noise." "Just a young fellow," she said apologetically. "The son of one of Bunting's old friends. He often comes here, sir, but he never did give such a great big double knock as that before. I'll speak to him about it." "Oh, no, Mrs. Bunting. I would really prefer you did nothing of the kind. It was just a passing annoyance, nothing more." She waited a moment. How strange that Mr. Sleuth said nothing of the hoarse cries which had made of the road outside a perfect bedlam every hour or two throughout that day! But no, Mr. Sleuth made no allusion to what might well have disturbed any quiet gentleman at his reading. "I thought maybe you'd like to have supper a little earlier to-night, sir?" "Just when you like, Mrs. Bunting, just when it's convenient. I do not wish to put you out in any way." She felt herself dismissed, and, going out quietly, closed the door. As she did so, she heard the front door banging to. She sighed. Joe Chandler was really a very noisy young fellow. End of